Morning. Today we're considering one piece of legislation and hopefully several nominations. Before I go to the agenda, I'd like to say a few words about the Supreme Court vacancy. I'm sure other members of this committee will want to do the same thing, but I hope we can do that and get on with our agenda quickly. On Monday evening, as everybody knows, the President announced Kavanaugh to serve as Associate Justice. Kavanaugh has a very distinguished record of public service in the executive branch and as a judge on the D.C. Circuit. He is one of the most influential judges in the country at this time. 12 of his opinions have been adopted by the Supreme Court. People that follow that history says that's a pretty remarkable record. But before the nomination of Kavanaugh was even announced, several outside groups that I'll categorize as liberal groups, and even some of my Democratic colleagues pledged to oppose any and all potential 25 nominees that everybody knows had been on the President's mind even before he was elected. No president has told the country what he might do in regard to the Supreme Court and actually list the people he might put on the court. That's pretty extraordinary. So people have had a chance to look at these 25 nominees for a long time and ought to know pretty much what sort of justices they would make. But instead of being open to evaluating the nominee on merit, it seems that interest groups and their allies announced a policy of preemptive obstruction. So we knew before the nomination was made that these senators were going to oppose whoever it was. The fact that not one of the 25 nominees was even worthy of their consideration says much more about the opposition than any of the nominees. It's clear that my colleagues have shown their hand, and when we hear arguments from the other side to slow down the process, we know the real reason is to block Kavanaugh's confirmation by any means necessary. In fact, just this week, the minority leader, in the presence of most of the members on the Democratic side of this committee, stated, quote, "We must defeat Judge Kavanaugh's nomination," end of quote. Therefore, while I'm committed to a full and fair confirmation process, because that's what the Constitution demands, I'll view complaints about the process with some degree of skepticism, and I think it's based on what's been said already. After all, those who will raise such complaints have already seemingly made up their minds. It's kind of like a jury that has already found a defendant guilty even before the trial begins. I want to address a few of the groundless arguments that we've heard so far. The first groundless argument: it's been said that we shouldn't confirm a Supreme Court nominee during a midterm election year. This is so inconsistent with historical precedent. Two sitting justices, Kagan and Breyer, they're still on the court, were confirmed in midterm election years. Many of their predecessors were as well. The Biden rule, by its terms, applies only to presidential election years. Nominating a Supreme Court justice is one of the president's most important duties. The Biden rule recognizes that the American people should weigh in on who makes the nomination, and that happens to be, under our Constitution, the President of the United States. That's why it applied to presidential election years. Because the President is not on the ballot, then this logic expressed about midterm elections doesn't apply. The second groundless argument: it's been said that the Senate shouldn't consider a nomination while Robert Mueller's investigation is ongoing. But this is also inconsistent with history, and frankly, I think a silly argument. For example, President Clinton nominated Justice Breyer while President Clinton was under investigation by the independent counsel. In fact, the independent counsel had the president's documents under a grand jury subpoena. President Trump is not in such a precarious situation. By all accounts that I've heard and read, he's not personally under investigation. And even if he were, what other constitutional duties do some of my Democrat colleagues demand that the president give up? I recognize this argument for what it is, a pretense advanced by those who are already opposed to Kavanaugh's confirmation. The third groundless argument, some have said that Kavanaugh doesn't believe a sitting president may be criminally investigated or prosecuted. This is false, and I'll tell you why. It's the opposite of what he said. What Kavanaugh wrote in a law review article is that Congress, meaning us, should pass a law to make the president temporarily immune from criminal prosecution while he is in office. This implies that Kavanaugh believes the president may be investigated and prosecuted under current law. Moreover, a nominee's academic musings are not law. Justices follow the law, including precedent. So I strongly urge my colleagues to stop misrepresenting Kavanaugh's writings, particularly on this issue. I've heard my colleagues say that he believes the president is above the law, but his article states that he strongly agrees with the principle that no one is above the law in our system of government. And around this table, every one of us obviously believes that. The Washington Post calls the minority's claim of extreme distortion and gave it 2 Pinocchios as a result. And 2 Pinocchios may be even too generous. I met with Kavanaugh earlier this week. I hope all of you have a chance to do the same thing. I urge you to keep an open mind. I think you'll find him highly accomplished, a highly respected nominee. Now to our agenda today. We have several nominees on the agenda for the first time, and the minority has requested, as they can under our rules, to hold it over. So these nominees will be held over. Marvin Quattlebaum, 4th Circuit; Julius Richardson, 4th Circuit; Roy Altman, Southern District, Florida; Raul Arias, District of Puerto Rico; and Rudolph Rees, Southern District of Florida. We intend to vote on Britt Grant to the 11th Circuit and Dave Porter to the 3rd Circuit. Justice Grant is a well-respected judge. Since joining the bench, she has a clear record of being fair and impartial. In 5 different cases, she ruled for criminal defendants when she found their sentences did not match the law, and in each case, she ordered the lower court to correct errors. Regardless of whether it's a criminal defendant or the state of Georgia, every individual is under the law, equal under the law when they come to Justice Grant's courtroom. She also previously served as her state's Solicitor General and clerked for the D.C. Circuit. I have confidence she'll make an excellent appellate judge. Regarding Mr. Porter's nomination, I understand that the minority is concerned that he didn't receive 2 positive blue slips from his home state senators. However, consistent with my blue slip policy and the policy of most of the other chairmen before me, at least 17 out of 19 of us, I'll generally continue to hold hearings on circuit court nominees who lack 2 positive blue slips if the White House has adequately consulted with home state senators. One senator generally does not have the right to block the other 99 of us from merely considering a circuit court nominee, so long as the White House has consulted with that senator. In the case of Mr. Porter's nomination, the White House reached out to Senator Casey more than a year before making the nomination and suggested several potential names. Senator Casey evidently rejected all the suggestions and never proposed any potential candidate. Eventually, the White House needs to move forward with filling vacancies, and because they did consult with Senator Casey, we're moving forward with the nomination. We have the Anti-Terrorism Clarification Act on the agenda. I introduced this bipartisan bill. It is co-sponsored by Senators Nelson, Rubio, Whitehouse, Cruz, Blumenthal, Tillis, Coons, Cornyn, and Hatch. As most of you know, I was the lead sponsor of the Anti-Terrorism Act of 1992. Sometimes we call that ATA. For over 25 years, the ATA has helped fight international terrorism and provide justice to our country's victims. Since then, however, terrorists and those who financially support them have tried to blow holes in the law and stretch its exception beyond what Congress ever intended. So this legislation makes 3 needed clarifications so that American victims of terrorism can continue to get justice, or at least seek it in our nation's courts, when terrorists or their supporters injure them. First, the bill clarifies the ATA's so-called act of war exception. It goes without saying, but Congress never intended that designated terrorist organizations could dodge liability for attacks that kill or injure Americans overseas by simply claiming this exception. But some have twisted the exception to get away scot-free. The act of war exception should not be a liability shield for designated terrorist organizations or their supporters. So this bill makes clear that the exception doesn't apply to those designated by the U.S. government as foreign terrorist organizations. And that ought to be pretty common sense change to this law. Secondly, the bill permits victims of narco-terrorism to satisfy court-awarded ATA judgments with the assets of foreign drug kingpins. Assets blocked by the federal government under the Kingpin Designation Act currently are not available to victims to satisfy those kinds of judgments. This bill fixes that. Third, the bill responds to recent federal court decisions that undermine the ability of American victims to bring terrorists to justice. My 1992 law was specifically designed to provide extraterritorial jurisdiction over terrorists who attack Americans overseas. Last year, I led an amicus brief with 22 bipartisan senators to the Supreme Court in Socolow versus the PLO, reiterating the purpose and scope of the 92 law. But I was stunned when our own Justice Department, the Trump Justice Department, failed to stand up in that case for American victims of terrorism. This bill makes crystal clear that defendants who take advantage of certain benefits from the U.S. government, such as foreign assistance, will be deemed to have consented to personal jurisdiction in ATA cases. No defendant should be able to enjoy privileges under U.S. law while simultaneously dodging responsibility for supporting terrorists that injure or kill Americans. The bill is supported by thousands of veterans and Gold Star families, by groups like AIPAC, Anti-Defamation League, American Jewish Committee, Christians United for Israel, the Endowment for Middle East Truth, the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, the National Council of Young Israel, the Orthodox Union, the Rabbinical Council of America, and the Zionist Organizations of America. Right here, I have several letters of support that I would include in the record without objection. The committee also, and I think that represents about 50,000 Americans, Senator Feinstein.